The confession came more than 30 years after a 14-year-old girl disappeared. For decades, investigators had searched for answers. Her family had lived with uncertainty. Missing person posters faded. Leads dried up. Witnesses moved away. Time marched forward. But one question refused to disappear. What happened to Aundria Michelle Bowman? The answer finally emerged, not because someone stumbled across an old file, but because a convicted killer decided to speak. His words would lead investigators to a wooded property in Hamilton, Michigan. There, beneath the ground that had hidden a terrible secret for decades, investigators discovered human remains. Scientific testing would later confirm what so many had feared. The remains belonged to Aundria. The discovery transformed a decades-old missing person case into a homicide investigation. It also forced investigators to confront an even more disturbing reality. The man who admitted responsibility was the same man who had raised her adoptive father. For years, Aundria's disappearance had been surrounded by uncertainty. Some believed she had run away. Others questioned whether she had chosen to leave. Investigators followed countless leads, but none could answer the most important question. Now, decades later, the truth was finally beginning to emerge. It was a truth built not on rumor, not on speculation, but on physical evidence, forensic science, and a confession that investigators carefully examined alongside everything they had spent years uncovering. Yet even after the confession, questions remained. Why had this happened? Could Aundria have been found sooner? Were there warning signs that had been overlooked? And how had one of Michigan's longest-running missing child investigations remained unsolved for more than 30 years? Those questions form the heart of this story, not simply because they reveal how the investigation unfolded, but because they remind us why every missing child deserves to be searched for until the truth is known. Before we continue, where are you watching from today? Leave your city in the comments. Cases like Aundria's remind us that someone, somewhere, may remember a detail that helps preserve the truth. Long before her disappearance became national news, before investigators searched wooded property, before forensic teams carefully recovered evidence, Aundria Michelle Bowman was simply a young girl trying to find her place in the world. She was born Alexis Badger in 1974. As an infant, she was adopted by Dennis and Brenda Bowman, who lived near Hamilton, Michigan. Following the adoption, her name became Aundria Michelle Bowman. Public records about Aundria's childhood remain limited, and much of what is known comes from official investigations, court proceedings, and statements made years after her disappearance. Those records indicate that life inside the Bowman household was far from stable. As investigators later documented, concerns existed within the family before Aundria disappeared. Exactly how those concerns developed over time has been described through court records and investigative findings, rather than public family accounts. Because this documentary is committed to verified facts, we will not speculate beyond what investigators and court documents established. What is clear is that Aundria attended school in the Hamilton area and, like many teenagers, was approaching an important stage of her life. She was 14 years old. She had hopes for the future. She had classmates who knew her, teachers who recognized her, a community that believed they understood the family living nearby. No one imagined that within days, Aundria would vanish. Her disappearance would become one of Michigan's most enduring missing child investigations. At first, it seemed possible that she had simply run away. Teenagers sometimes leave home voluntarily. Investigators must consider every possibility during the earliest stages of a missing person investigation. But as days became weeks, and weeks became months, no confirmed sightings emerged. No verified contact. No evidence that Aundria had started a new life elsewhere. The silence grew heavier with every passing year. For investigators, the case slowly shifted from an active missing person search into a cold case. For those who cared about Aundria, time offered no answers. Only more questions. Now that you know who Aundria was, what part of her story stays with you most so far? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. Keeping her memory alive is one way to ensure she is never forgotten. Then, in March 1989, everything changed. For several days after Aundria disappeared, investigators treated the case the way they would treat many reports involving missing teenagers. Every possibility had to be considered. Had she left voluntarily? Had she accepted a ride from someone she knew? Could she have been staying with friends or relatives? Or had something far more serious happened? According to investigators, Aundria Bowman was last seen in March 1989 at her family's home near Hamilton, Michigan. Shortly afterward, her adoptive parents reported that she had run away. At the time, that explanation influenced the direction of the investigation. Runaway reports involving teenagers were not uncommon, and investigators had to balance limited resources against countless other active cases. Still, officers searched. They interviewed family members. They spoke with neighbors. They checked locations where teenagers were known to gather. Schools were contacted. Friends were interviewed. Missing person bulletins were distributed. As days became weeks, investigators expanded the search beyond Hamilton. State agencies entered Aundria's information into missing person databases. Leads arrived from different communities. Each one had to be investigated. Every reported sighting carried hope. Every dead end brought disappointment. Despite the effort, none of those leads produced evidence that Aundria was alive. No verified bank activity. No confirmed employment. No school enrollment elsewhere. No official records suggesting she had built a new life under another identity. For detectives, something about the case never seemed complete. People who truly run away often leave a trail. A phone call, a letter, a friend who eventually speaks, some trace of continued life. In Aundria's case, that trail never appeared. Meanwhile, her biological family had their own unanswered questions. Years after the adoption, members of Aundria's biological family began searching for information about her. They wanted to reconnect. Instead, they discovered something deeply troubling. No one could explain where she had gone. That realization would later become an important part of the renewed investigation. As the years passed, the case gradually entered what investigators refer to as a cold case. That term does not mean detectives stop working. It simply means that all immediate investigative leads have been exhausted. Cold case files are reviewed repeatedly over time. Advances in forensic science, new witness statements, fresh investigative techniques. Sometimes, one small development changes everything. For Aundria's case, that moment would not arrive for decades. The passage of time also affected the people connected to the investigation. Investigators retired. New detectives inherited the case files. Communities changed. Neighbors moved away. Memories faded. Yet one fact remained constant. A 14-year-old girl had disappeared without a verified explanation. The Michigan State Police continued maintaining records. The case remained listed among missing children. Organizations dedicated to locating missing persons also preserved Aundria's information, ensuring her disappearance was never forgotten. As the years passed, improvements in technology gave investigators renewed hope. Digital record systems replaced paper files. DNA analysis became dramatically more advanced. National databases improved communication between agencies. Cold cases that once seemed impossible to solve suddenly became solvable. Across the United States, decades-old disappearances were being reopened. Investigators began asking whether Aundria's case might also benefit from modern forensic methods. But without knowing where she was, or what had happened, those advances could only go so far. Then, more than 30 years after Aundria disappeared, investigators received information connected to an entirely different homicide investigation. That information would completely change the direction of the case. The focus shifted away from searching for a runaway toward investigating a murder. For more than 3 decades, investigators had a missing teenager, but no confirmed evidence explaining where Aundria had gone. If you had been part of that investigation, what do you think would have been the most difficult obstacle to overcome? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. What detectives did not yet know was that the person holding the answers had been connected to the case from the very beginning, and in time, he would confess. More than 30 years had passed since Aundria Bowman disappeared. For most investigations, that amount of time makes finding answers increasingly difficult. Witnesses forget details, evidence deteriorates, people move away. Some die before investigators have the chance to question them again. Cold cases often become exercises in patience. Detectives continue reviewing files, hoping that one new lead will uncover what decades of investigation could not. For Aundria's case, that lead came from somewhere entirely unexpected. In 2019, investigators in Virginia were working another homicide investigation involving Dennis Bowman, Aundria's adoptive father. Authorities were investigating the disappearance of Kathleen Doyle, a young woman who vanished in 1980 after leaving a naval base in Norfolk, Virginia. For decades, Kathleen's case had remained unsolved. Then, advances in DNA technology connected Dennis Bowman to evidence recovered in that investigation. According to court records, Bowman eventually admitted responsibility for Kathleen Doyle's murder. During interviews with investigators, attention turned to another question that had followed him for decades. What happened to Aundria Bowman? For years, Dennis Bowman had maintained that Aundria had run away from home. That explanation had remained part of the missing person investigation since 1989. But during interviews connected to the Virginia case, Bowman eventually confessed to killing Aundria. Investigators did not simply accept the confession. Experienced detectives know that every confession must be tested against independent evidence. They asked detailed questions. They compared his statements with known facts. They looked for information only the person responsible could know. According to investigators, Bowman told them that Aundria died following an argument inside the family home in March 1989. He claimed she struck her head during the confrontation. Investigators carefully documented his account. He then led authorities to property near the family's former home in Allegan County, Michigan. For investigators, this was the moment the case changed forever. For more than 3 decades, they had searched for Aundria. Now, they were searching for her remains. Search teams assembled at the property. Crime scene specialists worked slowly and methodically. Every inch of ground was examined. Heavy equipment was brought in only after forensic experts identified areas requiring excavation. The process took time. Investigators understood they were no longer simply looking for evidence. They were recovering a child who had been missing for more than 30 years. Eventually, human remains were discovered. They were carefully documented before being removed for forensic examination. Scientists later conducted DNA testing. The results confirmed the identity investigators feared, but had long hoped to establish with certainty. The remains belonged to Aundria Michelle Bowman. After more than 3 decades, she had finally been found. For Aundria's biological family, the confirmation brought overwhelming emotion. The news ended years of uncertainty. Although it confirmed the worst possible outcome, it also answered the question that had haunted them since 1989. Where was Aundria? Investigators now had that answer. But their work was not finished. They still needed to determine whether the available evidence supported criminal charges under Michigan law. Detectives reviewed Bowman's confession alongside forensic findings, historical witness statements, and records collected over decades. The confession became one piece of a much larger investigation, not the investigation itself. That distinction mattered. Law enforcement's responsibility was to build a case supported by evidence, not by admissions alone. As investigators reconstructed the events surrounding Aundria's disappearance, they also re-examined decisions made during the original investigation. Cases from the late 1980s were handled under different investigative standards and with far fewer forensic tools than are available today. Modern DNA analysis, digital case management, and improved interagency communication have transformed how missing person investigations are conducted. Aundria's case illustrated both the limitations investigators once faced and the importance of preserving evidence for future review. Her story also underscored another difficult truth. Some families wait decades before learning what happened to someone they love. Some never receive answers at all. For Aundria's biological relatives, the discovery of her remains marked the first opportunity to mourn with certainty. Although nothing could undo what had happened, the truth replaced decades of unanswered questions. For more than 30 years, Aundria's biological family lived without knowing where she was. If you've ever waited years for an answer or for justice in any part of your life, you're welcome to share your experience respectfully in the comments. Stories of patience remind us why these investigations matter. Investigators had finally recovered Aundria. The confession had been made. The forensic evidence had been examined. Now, only one chapter remained: justice in the courtroom. For more than 3 decades, Aundria Michelle Bowman's name appeared on lists of missing children. Her photograph remained in databases maintained by law enforcement and organizations dedicated to missing persons. Every year that passed raised the same question: would investigators ever know what happened? By 2020, the answer was finally beginning to emerge. Following the recovery and identification of Aundria's remains, prosecutors reviewed the evidence collected by investigators. That evidence included Dennis Bowman's statements, forensic findings, historical investigative records, and witness interviews gathered over many years. After reviewing the case, prosecutors determined there was sufficient evidence to move forward. Dennis Bowman was formally charged in Michigan in connection with Aundria's death. For investigators who had inherited the case after decades of unanswered questions, the charges represented the culmination of years of patient work. It was also a reminder that time does not erase responsibility. Even after 30 years, justice can still be pursued. As the criminal case moved through the court system, Bowman remained incarcerated because of convictions in other cases. His prosecution in Michigan focused specifically on Aundria's death. During court proceedings, prosecutors presented evidence showing how the missing person investigation eventually transformed into a homicide investigation. The discovery of Aundria's remains had fundamentally changed the case. For years, investigators could only speculate whether she was alive. Now they knew she had died shortly after disappearing in 1989. The courtroom also became a place where Aundria's biological family finally had an opportunity to speak publicly about the loss they had carried for decades. For many years, they had searched for information about the daughter and sister they hoped to meet again. Instead, they learned she had never been given that opportunity. Their statements reflected both grief and gratitude. Grief for the years that had been stolen. Gratitude that investigators had never completely abandoned the case. In February 2022, Dennis Bowman entered a no-contest plea to the charge of second-degree murder in Aundria's death. Under Michigan law, a no-contest plea is not an admission of guilt in the traditional sense, but it allows the court to enter a conviction without requiring a trial. Because of the plea, Aundria's family was spared the emotional burden of lengthy courtroom testimony about the events surrounding her death. The court then turned its attention to sentencing. During the sentencing hearing, the judge considered the evidence, the decades that had passed, and the impact the crime had on Aundria's family. The court sentenced Dennis Bowman to 35 to 50 years in prison for Aundria's murder. That sentence was ordered to run consecutively to sentences he was already serving. For investigators, the sentence marked the legal conclusion of one of Michigan's oldest missing child investigations. For Aundria's family, it brought accountability. But accountability cannot restore lost time. It cannot return birthdays that were missed, family gatherings that never happened, or the future Aundria never had the chance to experience. One of the lasting lessons from Aundria's case is the importance of preserving evidence. When she disappeared in 1989, investigators did not have the forensic technology available today. DNA science was still developing. National databases were limited. Communication between agencies was slower than it is now. Yet because investigators preserved records and continued reviewing the case, later advances in science and investigative techniques helped uncover the truth. Another lesson is the importance of never assuming a missing person case has ended simply because many years have passed. Across the United States, cold case investigators continue solving disappearances that occurred decades earlier. New technology, fresh interviews, previously unknown witnesses, even investigations into unrelated crimes can unexpectedly provide the missing piece. That is exactly what happened in Aundria's case. Without the separate Virginia investigation involving Kathleen Doyle, investigators might never have obtained the information that ultimately led them to Aundria. The case also reminds us why careful reporting matters. For years, public discussion often centered on whether Aundria had run away. That possibility had to be investigated because it was one of several explanations available in 1989. But investigators continued examining the evidence instead of allowing assumptions to replace facts. When new evidence emerged decades later, they followed it wherever it led. That commitment ultimately brought the truth to light. We're about to reach the final chapter of Aundria's story. Before we close, what do you think ultimately broke this case open? The confession, advances in forensic science, or investigators refusing to let the case stay forgotten? Share your thoughts respectfully before continuing. Today, Aundria Michelle Bowman is no longer listed only as a missing child. She is remembered by name, by investigators who never stopped searching, by her biological family, and by everyone who believes that every missing child deserves to be found, no matter how many years have passed. The search for Aundria ended after more than 3 decades, but her story continues to serve as a reminder that cold cases are never simply old files sitting on a shelf. They are unfinished chapters waiting for the truth. For more than 30 years, Aundria Michelle Bowman's story existed as an unanswered question. A photograph of a smiling 14-year-old, a missing person report, a case file that grew older with every passing year. Many people believed the truth might never be known. Instead, the truth survived, hidden beneath decades of silence, waiting for investigators who refused to stop searching. When Aundria's remains were identified, the investigation reached a milestone that many families of missing children never experience. There was finally certainty, not the outcome anyone hoped for, but the truth. For her biological family, that truth ended decades of uncertainty. For investigators, it demonstrated why missing person cases should never be abandoned simply because time has passed. Cold cases often appear impossible to solve. Evidence becomes more difficult to locate. Witness memories fade. People relocate. Entire communities change. Yet history has repeatedly shown that justice does not always arrive quickly. Sometimes it arrives years later. Sometimes decades later. Aundria's case became one of those rare investigations where persistence, forensic science, and careful police work eventually uncovered what had been hidden for more than 3 decades. It also became a reminder that investigators must remain willing to re-examine old assumptions. When Aundria disappeared in 1989, one possibility was that she had run away. That explanation shaped the early investigation because, at the time, there was little evidence proving otherwise. As years passed, however, investigators continued asking difficult questions instead of allowing the original assumption to become the final answer. That willingness to revisit old evidence ultimately changed everything. The investigation also highlights how dramatically forensic science has advanced. Modern DNA analysis, improved evidence preservation, digital databases, interagency cooperation. These developments have transformed countless cold cases across North America. Cases once considered unsolvable are now being reopened with technologies investigators in the 1980s simply did not possess. Aundria's case stands among those examples. It reminds us that preserving evidence today may provide answers tomorrow. Another important lesson is the role played by cooperation between agencies. Investigators in Michigan did not solve the case entirely on their own. Information developed during an unrelated investigation in Virginia became a critical turning point. That cooperation between jurisdictions helped detectives uncover information that had remained hidden for decades. Modern investigations increasingly depend upon that kind of partnership. One agency may possess a single piece of evidence. Another may have a witness. A third may have forensic results. Only when those pieces come together does the full picture emerge. For Aundria, that cooperation finally brought her home. Although no criminal sentence can restore the life Aundria lost, accountability matters. Justice acknowledges the harm that was done. It recognizes the dignity of the victim, and it tells surviving family members that their loved one was never forgotten. Today, Aundria Michelle Bowman is remembered not simply because of how her life ended, but because investigators refused to allow her case to disappear. She was more than a missing person poster. More than a cold case file. She was a daughter, a classmate, a young girl whose future was taken far too soon. That is how she deserves to be remembered. At the Silence Evidence, that is the purpose behind every documentary. Not to sensationalize tragedy, not to encourage speculation, but to carefully examine verified facts while honoring the lives affected by these crimes. Because behind every investigation, there is a family. Behind every missing person report, there is someone who deserves answers. And behind every cold case, there remains hope that the truth can still be found. If Aundria's story has taught us anything, it is this: time alone does not end an investigation. Only the truth does. If Aundria Michelle Bowman's story moved you, consider sharing this documentary. Every share helps keep the stories of missing children alive and reminds others that many families are still waiting for answers. If you appreciate carefully researched true crime documentaries based on verified evidence, subscribe to Echo of Evidence for more cases that deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and always follow the evidence.